but let's shift and talk about the politics in France. Now, no, we're not a political commentator podcast. We're a leadership podcast, but there just happen to be these, these inappropriate behaviors that we've seen that, France, they're inappropriately responding to some things. So I don't know whether you've seen what's happened, but there was the French police had shot while trying to arrest a young man and I'll call him young man, a youth, and now there's been, it seems like France has been in riots for the entire year, haven't they? Pretty much.
Look, rioting is almost a way of life in France, particularly in Paris. It happens all the time, and protesting is very common. I think what's happened here is the level of violence has escalated way, way beyond anything that anybody could believe is reasonable.
Yeah, and so I think there's a couple of responses that I want to discuss with this. One is obviously the response of the people. We are talking about leaders, but it's leaders within the community that are actually causing this, right? Because if someone didn't lead this movement, it wouldn't happen. And so there's been violent riots now for the last week or so now because of this, since this shooting. That's one inappropriate response. The second inappropriate response is this article where the president of France, Macron, blames video games for these riots. So, as it says, fueled by rage over the police killing of a teenager during a routine traffic stop, June, throngs of young people in France have been lashing out against alleged racial profiling and calling for greater police accountability. There's been lots of riots and people injured and all that sort of stuff, and billions of worth of damage and stuff like that. So, and now the president is saying, well, it's those damn video games. First of all, Dr. Rod, let's talk about the response of the people. The response of the people. Obviously, violence is never the answer. How does it get like this? Like you say that protests are common over there and then therefore subsequently riots. What leads to this?
Oh, look, it's more complex than video games. There's no doubt about that. Video games may validate in some people's minds violent actions, but you can really hardly causally link video games with what's been going on in France. France has
I used to play a lot of video games, and I've never once felt the urge to grab a stick and run around the street smashing things.
No, but you are probably able to divide fantasy from the real world. Not everybody's good at doing that. But look, France has got a pretty serious racial problem, but you can't do any research on it because it's illegal to actually carry out research on that requires data on ethnicity or race. So here in Australia, of course, every time you do a survey, you're asked for information about your sex, and you're normally also asked for information about your ethnicity.
Yeah,
that's common. Well, certainly we do it in the census, and you do marketing surveys, many other surveys that come your way. They'll have some questions in there. Now in France, you're not allowed to do that. So they can't really research the problem. One of the things that has happened and by the way, I think we ought to make it very clear that the youth who were shot by police had a record. So the police weren't stopping that car for no reason. And the principle that we should let justice run its course has been totally ignored here. So that's something to keep in mind. And
let me jump on that, because I think that's actually a really good point. It quite clearly says in the Bible, God says, vengeance is mine, right? So we shouldn't be trying to enact vengeance. We shouldn't try to seek justice. We should trust, like if someone, try to kind of bring this back on us as leaders, if we have been wronged, we shouldn't be going out to seek to cut that person down, badmouth them in public, create a bad name about them, riot against them, try to do things to bring down their business, try to, do things to, like, we should trust the process and trust the systems and processes that we have in place. Now, will we always get justice? No. Will there be people that have done wrong by us that will get away with things? Yes. However, the Lord says, vengeance is mine. So we need to make sure that, yes, we stand up for ourselves. Yes, defend yourself. Use all of the righteous tools available to you. But then at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we can still, one very important thing, if we're going to be a good leader, we must learn to be able to forgive. We have to forgive when we've been wronged by people. We have to learn to be able to move on and bless that person. Moment for free, shameless plug, link down in the description, our free leadership development program, where we focus on week 2, I think it is, that we actually focus on forgiveness. And we go heavily into this because we cannot be leaders moving into the future while we're still carrying baggage from the past, while we're still looking backwards. So my aim, my suggestion to you is make sure that when you're leading, that you can make sure that you learn to forgive people. If you've been wronged by people, yes, go to the police, report what you need to. If you do need to go to court, think about it. The Bible quite clearly states about that. While you're on your way to church, if you got anything wronged by someone, go and sort it out. If you have to take someone legally, try to sort it outside of, if you can, and just figure out what it is what it's worth to you. Because sometimes when you're focused on vengeance of others, you're losing sight of your purpose. You're caught up you're caught up with the priorities of trying to enact something against someone else rather than being focused on your purpose, and be distracted from your purpose. So my encouragement to you is one lesson we can learn from this is make sure that as leaders, that we don't try to seek vengeance ourselves, that we learn to forgive people, that we learn to ask for forgiveness or forgive people, and be able to learn to bless them as well. I think that's part of the our forgiveness stuff that we talk about is like you got to learn to be able to forgive people. Sorry, Dr. Rod, I just went on a bit of a rant there, and to be honest, I thought you had disappeared, but I realized you were further down because there was Yash has multiple screens. Well, actually, we've got way too many screens open here, so I thought I'd lost you there, so I did try to rant just a little bit longer. So, okay, yeah, that's a really good point. Vengeance. Let's not do that. Now, sorry, keep going. I interrupted you.
No, well, look, vengeance doesn't really contribute anything positive to civil society. So we should let justice run its course. But let's face it, human systems of justice are fallible, and sometimes they don't deliver justice. I'm not the kind of person who says there's never ever a reason to use violence. I think there are some times when violence is justified. I doubt that it is here, because it's the way in which it's directed. It's actually hurting people who are not very well off. All those businesses that were trashed, most of those businesses are run by small businesses
Yeah.
who employ a handful of people. So you trash a small family business who employs maybe 3 or 4 family members and a couple of other people from the community. They've all lost their job. How does that help? It doesn't. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing that we have to keep in mind here is that France has got a particular problem with North African migrants whose worldview is Islamic. And political Islam can be very destructive against a democracy. And look, that is just a fact. There are many other immigrants in France who they've assimilated very well. They love being in France. Look, France has got one of the most generous social welfare systems on the planet, and that, of course, has caused a bit of protesting in recent times as the government has tried to increase the pension eligible age over there. That was fairly recent too, of course. But it's a very generous country. It's been very, very generous and welcoming to migrants. And it doesn't have a multicultural policy, as is the case in Australia. And what's tended to happen is that these large migration flows, not all legal, from the North African countries, which are Muslim in nature, and some of them were former French colonies too, by the way. They've come into France and they've tended to establish their own enclaves. Some people call them ghettos, and they haven't actually assimilated into the rest of the country. They don't actually accept democratic values. They don't accept the legitimacy of the authorities in France. And frankly, they look for excuses to riot. And that's one of the things that's been happening here. And this isn't the first country in which it's happened either, by the way. But France has a particular problem with certain groups of migrants who have chosen to separate themselves. They do have a rather different worldview. They don't have the same respect for the authorities as most other people in France do. And that's why the protest turned quickly into riots. But those riots have really damaged a lot of people who are basically innocent bystanders. They're running small businesses. They employ a handful of people. The businesses go down the drain and those people don't have a job. And it doesn't really do any good for anybody. There's a lot of anger there. The leaders are deliberately stirring up that. And by the way, it's not all that easy to identify the leaders because there's a good deal of anarchy there. In other words, it's leaderless rioting where people just riot. And some of them make some economic gain from it because they're able to steal from shops that they trash. For some of them, no doubt, it's a release of pent-up frustration.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that the key issue here is that there are groups who do not really want to be part of a nation. Now, I do actually believe that the biblical norm is for nations. God builds nations. God deals with nations. He molded the tribes of Israel into a nation, or at least he tried to. They didn't always want to be a united nation, as we know. And there was, of course, the northern nation and the southern nation for a long time, and they even fought against one another. But God's heart is to build tribes into nations. God is not into tribes. And I think, moving away from France, I think one of the big issues that we have in the West, in the Western countries today, is that we are recessing or retrogressing, I should say, we're retrogressing back into tribal organisation, which goes against biblical wisdom, and it can only bring about evil. It can't do us any good. And we're seeing that in France.
Yeah, 100%, and we're seeing it everywhere else where we're starting to see people a very tribal mentality. It's us versus them, and in divisions, even within divisions, and it seems to be one of the devil's little tools to try to keep us apart by just keep us divided.
Well, tribalism undermines family. It undermines both family, which is the basic and the smallest unit within a nation. It undermines the nation as a whole. So, it really has got nothing to recommend it at all, in my view.
So, tribalism is an issue. We are seeing it. What would you recommend? Like, how do we as leaders, like, I suppose on a global scale, how should we as leaders better influence to prevent tribalism? And how should we, on a micro scale, how should we as leaders prevent like tribalism in ourselves and in our organizations?
Oh, we've got to reject tribalism. I think we have to be. Look, I mean, this is an issue. It's an issue of worldview. I believe that the biblical worldview favours nationhood over tribalism.
Yeah.
And look, we've just got to know what we believe and why we believe it. I believe that God takes tribes and he fashions them into nations. And that seems to me to be much of what the biblical narrative is about. The fact that in numerous passages in the Bible, we see that God deals with nations. He doesn't deal with tribes. So that implies to me that the unit, the two most important units, as it were, are family and nation. And our worldview should be very, very wary of tribes and tribalism, because it disintegrates nations and it undermines family.
What are some of the warning signs of tribalism?
Belongingness. I think once we start defining ourselves as belonging to, say, a dissident group, it doesn't have to be based on race or ethnicity. It can be based on other things as well. But as soon as we get into a situation where we see ourselves as part of us and others are part of them, that's when we're descending into a tribal situation. And that brings about disunity. Eventually, the us becomes more important than the family. That's what we see. And it tears up families. And, God is for family. So we have to resolve in our minds what we believe and why we believe it as leaders. And
that's right.
I think it's significant that you don't hear many Christians saying that this is a good thing. And I think on the whole, Christians understand God loves families. He created families in the first place way back. In Genesis 1, we see the basis for the family. And he brings people together to fashion nations. And ultimately, of course, he will judge the nations.
Yeah, that's really good. So as leaders, be wary of vengeance and be wary of tribalism to avoid the inappropriate response that we've seen in France. Hey, you've just watched an excerpt from the On the Cube Leadership podcast. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If it challenged your leadership or inspired you in some way, put a comment below. And if you want to watch the full episode or more content like this, check out our channel. And hey, consider subscribing while you're there.